When Julian asked me if we should genuinely fear Beijing's rising global shadow, I realized the entire world was fixated on the wrong question entirely. I must confess that I previously believed I fully comprehended the geopolitical dynamics surrounding China's ascent. However, my own viewership recently dismantled that confidence, not through forceful opinions, but through penetrating inquiries. These were the types of questions that compelled me to rigorously re-examine the underlying data. What I uncovered was not a series of deafening headlines. Rather, it was a phenomenon far more subtle and infinitely more perilous. While the global community remains mesmerized by armed conflicts, ballistic missiles, and partisan politics, China is expanding its influence through an entirely divergent methodology. There is no chaotic noise and no direct confrontation, merely the relentless expansion of economic systems. Consequently, in this presentation, I am taking an unconventional approach. I am not here to stubbornly defend my previous analysis. I am here to meticulously correct it. A mere 3 days ago, I published a survey on this platform posing a straightforward question. Are you genuinely anxious about China's accelerating global supremacy? I anticipated the customary division of sentiments, expecting some palpable fear, a degree of measured concern, and perhaps a third of respondents indicating they were observing the situation with caution. What I absolutely did not anticipate was the actual outcome. 100% of the participants, every solitary individual who cast a vote, indicated either a welcoming attitude toward China's ascent or a complete absence of apprehension. 0% registered fear and 0% registered concern. I need you to mentally digest that statistic for a moment. That figure is not merely astonishing, it reveals a profound truth about what the vast majority of observers are completely overlooking. That overlooked reality forms the bedrock of today's extensive lecture. Your personal savings, your intricate supply chains, and the fundamental pricing of every commodity you purchase are already deeply entangled within this unfolding narrative, regardless of whether you embrace it or reject it. The overwhelming majority of geopolitical analysts remain fixated on China's military apparatus. These professionals are busily cataloging naval vessels and hypersonic projectiles, and while I comprehend their rationale, they are focusing their attention on an entirely incorrect metric. The experts fixating on the wrong variables will inevitably be the final individuals to grasp the magnitude of what has already transpired. I have dedicated the past 10 years to scrutinizing how dominant superpowers secure actual victories. I do not study their rhetorical claims of triumph. I study their genuine foundational objectives. The most unwavering historical pattern across every ascending empire is this: nations that violently and loudly conquer territory inevitably forfeit it. Conversely, those that quietly seize the underlying infrastructure, the entities that establish the rules, control the logistical arteries, and dictate the pricing mechanisms retain their dominance indefinitely. During the initial quarter of 2026 alone, China registered an astounding trade surplus of $264.7 billion. Allow me to reiterate that magnitude. Within a 90-day window, $264 billion more exited Chinese borders than entered them. That is not merely a routine quarterly financial metric. That represents a fundamental restructuring of the global macroeconomic landscape condensed into a singular data point. At this juncture, I require you to pause and entirely reevaluate your presumed understanding of this situation. The average individual hears the term trade surplus and immediately assumes China is simply exporting more merchandise than it imports. While factually accurate, that perspective represents a fundamentally flawed analytical framework. What a surplus of that colossal magnitude truly signifies is that the remainder of the international community is handing China a promissory note, and Beijing is consciously deciding to accept it. China is deliberately electing to hold binding claims on the future economic output of every single nation currently operating at a deficit against them. This is no longer traditional commerce. This is the construction of a permanent financial architecture. Two colossal forces are currently on a trajectory of direct collision. On one side, we have the United States dollar system, an architecture that mandates foreign nations to acquire dollars to secure essential global commodities. On the opposing side, we find China's expanding trade network, a mechanism that increasingly empowers foreign governments to bypass American currency altogether. Both frameworks absolutely cannot endure at maximum operational capacity. Only one paradigm will dictate the trajectory of the upcoming century. Let us initiate this evaluation with the participant you likely presume is dominating the board, the United States. I intend to systematically illustrate exactly why that assumption demands rigorous re-examination. America's strategic global positioning is anchored upon three foundational pillars: overwhelming military supremacy, the entrenched status of the global reserve currency, and an expansive network of international alliances. These advantages are tangible, and I am certainly not minimizing their significance. Nevertheless, I urge you to recognize a crucial vulnerability. Two of those three primary pillars face direct existential threats from the precise same mechanism, and this mechanism operates without demanding the discharge of a single weapon. Disregard what Washington publicly states it desires. America's genuine core objective is to endure as the indispensable global hegemon, the singular authority whose explicit approval remains mandatory before any substantial international transaction can successfully clear. That prestigious positioning is currently experiencing immense structural pressure, stemming not from Chinese ballistic weaponry, but from Chinese commercial invoicing. When Saudi Arabia officially invoices its petroleum exports in the Yuan, that specific transaction completely circumvents the necessity for American authorization. When Malaysia finalizes its bilateral trade settlements utilizing the yuan, that capital flow entirely bypasses the infrastructure of the American financial system. The United States military remains fully intact, yet its indispensable global status is steadily eroding. Now, direct your attention toward Europe. The European continent represents the participant that most analysts neglect during these discussions, which constitutes a severe miscalculation because Europe serves as the ultimate geopolitical pivot. The European Union recently absorbed an $83 billion trade deficit against China within one solitary quarter. The influx of Chinese electric vehicles penetrating European borders nearly doubled on a year-over-year basis, reaching $20.6 billion. The Guardian newspaper explicitly labeled this phenomenon a China shock. That specific terminology is hardly coincidental. It is deliberately adopted from the original economic shockwave of the late 1990s and early 2000s. An era when the surge of Chinese manufacturing decimated millions of American industrial occupations. Europe is currently viewing a reboot of that exact historical sequence, yet this time the exported commodity is not inexpensive textiles. The contested product is the very future of the global automotive industry, which happens to be the single most substantial manufacturing sector across the European continent. The region now confronts a structural dilemma that its leadership has yet to publicly resolve. Europe can choose to shield its domestic industries via heavy tariffs, thereby aligning its trajectory intimately with Washington's economic philosophy. Alternatively, Europe can welcome Chinese capital investment into its domestic EV infrastructure, thereby acquiring heavily subsidized technology while simultaneously forfeiting its own industrial sovereignty. The continent absolutely cannot pursue both paths simultaneously. Furthermore, every moment Europe delays finalizing this critical decision transfers additional diplomatic leverage directly to Beijing. I urgently request your undivided attention for my subsequent point, as the less time I dedicate to discussing this third participant, the more intensely you must scrutinize the implications. That participant is Iran. You must fundamentally grasp that Iran does not serve as the primary subject of this geopolitical analysis. Rather, Iran represents the definitive empirical proof validating it. Over the trailing 18 months, Iran, operating under the absolute maximum threshold of American economic pressure, completely severed from the global dollar infrastructure, and heavily sanctioned across every conceivable metric, somehow managed to post net positive industrial output. The Iranian economy did not implode. The singular reason it avoided total collapse can be summarized in one word: China. Iran functions as the ultimate diagnostic test case illustrating what a post-dollar ecosystem provides for a heavily sanctioned national economy, and the experiment was a resounding success that represents an insurmountable challenge. It is no longer a solvable crisis. It has transitioned into a strictly manageable condition. The impending question is simply this: who ultimately manages this new ecosystem and who becomes subservient to it? Please firmly hold this upcoming fact in your immediate thought. Moody's, which is emphatically not a Chinese financial institution nor a partisan geopolitical commentator, recently upgraded China's macroeconomic outlook to a stable status. They executed this upgrade while the overarching global financial system strains under immense stress and while an international trade conflict aggressively escalates. That action does not represent a mere corporate endorsement. It serves as a glaring beacon. I will explicitly decode exactly what that beacon signals throughout the ensuing section. The first structural reality is that the Chinese export engine is not decelerating. It is violently accelerating directly into macroeconomic headwinds. During January and February of 2026, China's total exports expanded by 21.8% compared to the previous year. Across the entirety of the first quarter, aggregate exports surged to $977 billion, representing a 14.7% increase. These staggering figures are materializing while the United States government actively attempts to suffocate Chinese international commerce. The imposed tariffs are substantial and the applied restrictions are rigorous, yet the economic expansion continues to accelerate regardless. We are not merely observing a resilient national economy, we are witnessing an economic juggernaut that has permanently restructured its own foundations to seamlessly bypass American legislative pressure. Back in 2020, the Chinese trade surplus hovered around $500 billion. By the conclusion of 2025, that metric had skyrocketed to $1.2 trillion, the absolute highest surplus ever documented by any sovereign nation in recorded modern history. Over a brief 5-year span, the surplus more than doubled in size. That data point is not a temporary statistical anomaly. It is a permanent structural paradigm shift. The second structural reality is that China has successfully severed its industrial expansion from its historical reliance on Western consumer demand. The foundational assumption driving Western tariff strategies operates on this premise. If foreign governments deliberately inflate the cost for China to export its goods to Western markets, the Chinese manufacturing apparatus will inevitably stall. However, that hypothesis intrinsically requires China's industrial output to remain heavily dependent upon Western consumption patterns. Contrarily, Chinese industrial profitability expanded by 15% during the first quarter of 2026, occurring during a window of maximum tariff hostility originating from both the United States and the European Union. The Chinese industrial foundation simply does not rely on Western exports in the manner that conventional Western strategists presume. Beijing is progressively pivoting its sales toward the global south, penetrating Southeast Asian territories, and saturating Middle Eastern markets regions that remain entirely outside the jurisdiction of Western tariff architectures. The third structural reality confirms that the underlying mechanism guaranteeing the durability of this entire system possesses no direct correlation to the internal Chinese economy. This observation transcends my personal opinion. It stands as one of the most rigorously validated principles within the discipline of monetary economics, despite an astonishing lack of coverage within mainstream commentary. Every sovereign nation currently operating a massive trade surplus with China is busy accumulating financial claims denominated strictly in yuan, completely bypassing the dollar. Any nation hoarding yuan-denominated assets inherently develops a strong incentive to discover viable methods to deploy that capital. Consequently, they possess a vested interest in utilizing the yuan for their future international transactions. This dynamic naturally creates a compounding incentive for the yuan to seamlessly transition into a functional global reserve currency. This sophisticated transition does not mandate a triumphant Chinese military campaign, nor does it necessitate a humiliating American military defeat. It merely requires the uninterrupted continuation of the precise trends that are already visibly unfolding. That 2025 trade surplus of $1.2 trillion literally translates to $1.2 trillion of unrelenting structural pressure actively pushing against the dominant dollar ecosystem, all generated within a single calendar year without the firing of a solitary weapon. Once you conceptually grasp this reality, you can never blind yourself to its existence again. The fourth structural reality dictates that the geopolitical point of no return is not a distant theoretical event. It possesses an impending date on the calendar. Chinese industrial factory activity is projected to expand throughout April of 2026, admittedly at a moderately reduced velocity, yet still expanding. It is not contracting, nor is it collapsing under the weight of foreign pressure. It is undeniably expanding. The critical debate no longer revolves around whether China's structural dominance over international trade will fundamentally rewrite the global monetary ecosystem. The true question centers on what rapidly unfolds during the 18 months immediately following the moment the first major G20 economy officially transitions to settling its massive Chinese trade deficits utilizing the yuan on a monumental scale. This will not manifest as a temporary experimental pilot program, but rather as the standardized operational procedure of global commerce. Now, I must illuminate a critical concept that the vast majority of traditional analysts completely overlook. All of the information I have just presented, those four defining structural realities, collectively point toward one unified mechanism. That specific mechanism possesses a definitive title. It is recognized as structural dependency. The moment a sovereign nation becomes structurally reliant upon Chinese commercial trade, Chinese technological infrastructure, or Chinese capital financing, that nation's foreign policy flexibility permanently evaporates. Examining the evidence I just highlighted, the sheer scale, the rapid acceleration, the underlying monetary mechanisms, and the ensuing dependency, most conventional analysts utilize this exact data to loudly forecast an unavoidable military confrontation between the United States and China. They predict a kinetic hot war, an elongated Cold War, or an apocalyptic financial rupture. I firmly maintain that their conclusions are entirely erroneous. The rationale is quite straightforward. China possesses absolutely no need to engage in armed conflict to secure ultimate victory. Kinetic conflict is notoriously expensive, highly unpredictable, and exceptionally dangerous for any creditor nation. China operates as the ultimate global creditor. Creditors hold zero desire to see the existing system violently collapse. They simply wish for the system to perpetually operate under their newly dictated terms. My strategic analysis points toward one overwhelmingly dominant scenario: a methodical, incredibly slow structural renegotiation of the entire global hierarchy, executed not across a highly publicized diplomatic negotiating table, but silently forged through 10,000 individual, localized trade treaties, infrastructure investment agreements, and bilateral currency arrangements. Each individual transaction appears remarkably small in isolation. Yet, when woven together, the resulting fabric becomes utterly irreversible. Over the impending 6 months, you must meticulously monitor one highly specific geopolitical signal. Watch very closely to see if Saudi Arabia aggressively expands its yuan-denominated petroleum settlements far beyond their initial pilot programs. If that expansion is officially confirmed before the conclusion of 2026, the traditional petrodollar ecosystem, the very foundation that has actively underwritten American financial hegemony since the year 1974, will formally enter a state of permanent structural decline. I must emphasize the word decline, not an immediate collapse. That specific semantic difference is crucially important. Furthermore, within the next 18 months, carefully observe the official European legislative response to the ongoing China shock. If the European Union chooses to implement substantial tariffs against electric vehicles without simultaneously securing a robust, parallel trade compromise with Beijing, Europe will have effectively chosen to submit to the American economic framework. In retaliation, China will strategically respond by massively accelerating its direct capital investments into Southeast Asian electric vehicle manufacturing sectors, effectively routing European consumer demand through completely distinct third-party nations. Ultimately, Europe will firmly establish its protective tariff, yet European consumers will still inevitably purchase the Chinese automobile. The European citizen will simply be forced to pay a significantly higher premium to acquire it. Looking exactly 5 years into the future, the single most consequential and heavily debated question within the realm of global geopolitics will absolutely not center around the fate of Taiwan, nor will it involve territorial disputes within the South China Sea. Instead, the ultimate question will be this: does the International Monetary Fund deliberately expand its special drawing rights basket to officially integrate the yuan, assigning it a mathematical weight that accurately reflects China's true share of global commerce? That specific institutional decision, finalized within the city limits of Washington by a financial organization that the United States historically controls, will serve as the definitive, undeniable signal of whether America successfully manages the rise of China, or if America has resigned itself to being managed by it. That is the only decision you must watch, as every other piece of diplomatic news is merely distracting noise. Let us address the pressing inquiries regarding this data. Is China's purported economic growth factually real, or is it heavily inflated through deliberate state manipulation? The objective answer acknowledges that direct governmental intervention within the Chinese macroeconomic environment is undeniably real and exceptionally significant. However, the reported trade surplus statistics are not exclusively generated by potentially biased Chinese domestic statistics agencies. Those exact numbers are rigorously cross-verified and confirmed by the inbound import data meticulously collected by China's international trading partners. They are validated by stringent European customs authorities, corroborated by exhaustive American maritime port records, and authenticated by numerous Southeast Asian ministries of trade. A documented surplus of $1.2 trillion literally guarantees that $1.2 trillion worth of physical commodities successfully departed Chinese shipping ports and physically arrived at international destinations. It is mathematically impossible to fabricate the final destination of physical cargo. But what about the widely publicized Chinese domestic debt crisis and the impending real estate property collapse? I readily acknowledge that the highly publicized Evergrande financial collapse and the severe stress fracturing the Chinese property sector are entirely factual. A rapidly deteriorating domestic real estate sector represents a genuine, painful internal constraint restricting overall Chinese macroeconomic growth. However, I desperately need you to recognize exactly what transpired concurrently. The Chinese industrial manufacturing base and its formidable export engine continued accelerating at a breakneck pace while its domestic property sector suffocated under severe financial distress. That dynamic does not manifest within a fragile economy dependent upon a singular engine of growth. It solely occurs within a sophisticated economy that has successfully and deliberately diversified its underlying productive foundations far away from volatile property speculation. The internal financial stress is undoubtedly real, but the systemic resilience is equally real. So, what specific, actionable steps should you personally take armed with this complex information? Immediately cease your daily monitoring of sensationalized military headlines, as those tactical developments are the absolute last indicators that will inform you when something fundamentally important is shifting beneath your feet. Instead, you must obsessively monitor one singular metric at the conclusion of every single financial quarter: China's documented trade surplus, specifically concerning your home nation. The exact moment that specific financial figure crosses an undeniable threshold where your domestic government can no longer afford to politically ignore it, triggering a reactionary domestic political response, is the exact chronological moment your home country's fundamental relationship with the global dollar system initiates a permanent transformation. That is the exact moment that directly impacts your personal savings, heavily degrades the stability of your pension, and actively erodes your daily purchasing power. The blaring military headline is merely theatrical distraction. The silent trade statistic is the actual script dictating the future. Look back to the year 1956, when Great Britain and France aggressively launched the Suez Crisis, a kinetic military intervention meticulously designed to forcefully reassert Western control over the vital Suez Canal immediately after the Egyptian government moved to nationalize it. The European powers successfully won the tactical military operation within a matter of weeks. However, applied American financial pressure specifically, a credible threat from Washington to liquidate vast holdings of British pound reserves and intentionally collapse the value of their currency ultimately forced the British Empire into a humiliating withdrawal. The single most formidable and technologically advanced military apparatus on the European continent was decisively halted, not by an opposing army, but by the devastating leverage of a balance sheet. Great Britain functioning in 1956 perfectly mirrors the geopolitical position of the United States right now. The traditional tactical tools of global dominance continue to function effectively, but the underlying financial architecture that ultimately makes those tactical tools relevant and necessary is currently being quietly and methodically rebuilt entirely around them. China does not represent the role of Egypt within this historical analogy. China firmly represents the undeniable power of the balance sheet itself. This monumental structural paradigm shift is not a future event looming on the horizon. It is already fully embedded within our current data. Furthermore, the 100% of my viewership who explicitly stated they either openly welcome this transition or are completely unbothered by its implications might actually be entirely correct in their final assessment. However, they are likely correct for entirely flawed reasons, and the critical intellectual distance between holding the right reason and any will ultimately determine whether you are adequately prepared for the realities that the current data already proves are mathematically inevitable. History is incredibly cruel, and it absolutely does not forgive those who arrogantly ignore its most vital lessons. That concludes my comprehensive analysis for today's session. Please remember, this presentation is not an exercise in mystical prophecy. This is an application of rigorous game theory intersecting with structural geopolitical history. If my assessments ultimately prove to be incorrect, we will return to this exact topic and forensically dissect precisely why the data misled us. Ultimately, that process of discovery is the true purpose of this educational platform.